The air outside the Orleans Parish Courthouse was thick and suffocating, a familiar Louisiana cocktail of humidity, exhaust fumes, and decaying magnolias. It was a circus of flashing cameras and shouting reporters, all pressing forward against a fragile police barricade. But from where Isabelle Izzy Dubois stood under the cool shade of an ancient oak tree, the chaos felt a world away, like a pantomime played out behind a pane of glass. The heavy oak doors of the courthouse burst open, and the crowd surged forward. First came the U.S. Marshals, their faces grim and impassive, and then, between them, was Cassandra Thorne. The woman who had descended upon Izzy's life like a hurricane was no longer the picture of cold, triumphant glamour. Her designer suit was rumpled, her immaculate blonde hair was a tangled mess, and her face, contorted with pure, undiluted rage, was stripped of all its artifice. The silver glint of handcuffs bound her wrists. As the marshals guided her down the steps, her wild eyes scanned the crowd until they locked onto Izzy. A guttural, animalistic sound ripped from her throat. She lunged, pulling against the marshal's grip with a surprising strength. "You!" she screamed, her voice a raw, ragged shriek that cut through the media din. "You sanctimonious little nobody? You think you've won? He's dead. The money was my birthright. Mine. This little courtroom trick won't save you. You'll pay for this." The reporters swarmed, microphones thrust forward like weapons. "Miss Thorne, any comment on the wire fraud conviction? Is it true you knowingly sold assets you didn't have the right to? Mrs. Dubois, how does it feel to reclaim your husband's estate?" Izzy didn't move. She stood perfectly still, a quiet island in a sea of noise, her simple, elegant black dress, a stark contrast to the chaos around her. She was a widow in mourning, yet her posture was not one of grief, but of profound, weary resolve. Her hand was in the pocket of her dress, her fingers wrapped tightly around the cool, worn surface of a tarnished silver locket. Her thumb traced the outline of an inscription too small to see, a silent, repeated motion that kept her anchored. She watched as the marshals finally wrestled Cassandra into the back of a black sedan. The door slammed shut, cutting off a final, venomous curse. The car peeled away from the curb, and the frantic energy of the crowd began to dissipate, leaving behind only a few straggling camera crews and the lingering, ugly echo of the confrontation. It was over. Justice, in its own complicated and unsatisfying way, had been served. But as Izzy stood there, the weight of the last month pressing down on her, her mind wasn't on the legal victory or the fraud conviction. It was on a different day, just 30 days prior, a lifetime ago. A day filled not with the sound of cameras and curses, but with the funereal drone of a church organ and the scent of too many white lilies. A day when her world was defined not by lawsuits and revenge, but by a grief so absolute she thought it would physically tear her in two. How had that shattered, heartbroken woman from the day of the funeral become the silent, avenging architect of this one? 1 month earlier. A lifetime ago. The air inside St. Louis Cathedral was heavy with the cloying, funereal scent of lilies and gardenias. Izzy sat in the front pew, a small, dark figure in a bespoke mourning dress, the thin veil of her hat the only defense she had against the pitying eyes of the entire city. The sound of the church organ was a mournful drone, punctuated by the soulful wail of a saxophone from the jazz band playing a dirge out on Jackson Square, a New Orleans funeral tradition Julian had always loved. Everything was perfect, respectful, and utterly meaningless. Izzy felt like she was underwater, the sounds of the service, the whispered condolences, the gentle hands on her shoulder, all muffled into a distant, hollow hum. She was an actress in her own tragedy, playing a role for which she'd had no rehearsal. The grief was not an emotion, it was a state of being. It was in the air she breathed, in the empty space beside her on the oak pew, in the cold weight of the wedding band on her finger, a ring that had now lost its partner. Her mind drifted from the priest's eulogy, back through the glittering fragments of 10 perfect years. They were New Orleans' golden couple. Julian Dubois, the charming, handsome heir to an old Creole fortune, and Isabelle, the brilliant architectural historian whose eyes could find the beauty in the oldest, most weathered brick, who had captured his heart completely. She remembered the night they met at a masquerade ball, he dressed as a pirate, she a Creole queen. She remembered their first dance in a French Quarter courtyard, under the glow of gaslights and the sound of a live Zydeco band. She remembered how he'd hunted through dusty old bookshops for months to find her a first edition of a rare architectural text, a surprise gift that had made her cry. The lazy Sunday mornings in the sunroom of their Garden District mansion, him reading the paper, her sketching, their legs tangled together, a comfortable silence more intimate than any words. Their life had been a carefully curated fairy tale, and she had believed in every word of it. She believed she knew this man, from his artist soul to his private fear of never living up to the Dubois name. She believed their love was an impenetrable fortress. And then, he was gone. A phone call. A freak hiking accident on a treacherous trail he loved. A slip, a fall. The sheriff had said, his voice full of practiced sympathy, sudden, senseless. No goodbye, no final moment. Just an abrupt, shrieking silence where he used to be. When the service was over, Izzy returned to their home, a grand space now haunted by his absence. The condolence flowers were already beginning to wilt. She wandered through the silent rooms, each object, each painting, a testament to a shared life that was now just a collection of memories. She was Julien Dubois's grieving widow. That was her entire identity now. She wrapped herself in his favorite cashmere sweater, believing that his love and their shared past were the only thing she had left to cling to. She had no idea that in less than a week, even that would be stolen from her, not by death, but by a single sheet of paper. The paper arrived a week later, a week spent in a grief-stricken fog where Izzy drifted like a ghost through her own home. The condolence flowers had wilted, and the silence in the Garden District mansion had grown heavy, punctuated only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. The letter, on the stately, cream-colored letterhead of Baptiste and Sons, was a cold, formal summons back to a world she had been trying to avoid. The reading of the will. Marcus Baptiste's office was in a historic red brick building, all high ceilings, floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves, and the scent of old leather. Marcus was more than Julian's lawyer. He had been his best friend, the best man at their wedding. He rose as Izzy entered, his face etched with a pained formality, a terrible combination of personal loss and professional duty. Izzy sat in the leather chair across from his desk, expecting no surprises. She assumed it was a formality, a painful but necessary step in the settling of her late husband's affairs. Julian had no other close family, and she was his wife. Everything would pass to her. It was the way the world worked. Marcus cleared his throat, his discomfort almost palpable. "Izzy, thank you for coming," he began, his eyes avoiding hers. "As you know, I am the primary executor of Julian's will. But there's something I was unaware of until last week. It seems Julian filed a codicil 6 months ago. He did it with another firm, out of state." A cold sense of unease pierced through the fog of Izzy's grief. Marcus opened a folder and began to read in a flat monotone, the voice of a lawyer trying to divorce himself from the words he was forced to speak. He went through the minor bequests, the funeral instructions, the small charitable donations. Then he arrived at the main body of the will. "I, Julien Antoine Dubois, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare," Marcus read, his voice faltering slightly, "that I bequeath the entirety of my estate, including all properties real and personal, all financial holdings, all shares in Dubois Enterprises, and the family home at 1427 Prytania Street, to one Miss Cassandra Thorne." The name hung in the still, quiet air of the office. Cassandra Thorne. It meant nothing. A string of nonsensical syllables. "I'm sorry, Marcus," Izzy said, a confused, almost panicked smile touching her lips. "I must have misheard you. Who is Cassandra Thorne? There must be some mistake." The pained expression on Marcus's face was her answer. "There's no mistake, Izzy." He took a deep, steadying breath. "The codicil further states that you are to be provided a monthly stipend of $5,000 for a period of 1 year to cover transitional living expenses." Transitional living expenses. The cold, corporate words were more painful than the disinheritance itself. It wasn't just a financial adjustment, it was an eviction, a public repudiation. In an instant, her 10-year, perfect marriage was reframed as a temporary arrangement, and she, the beloved wife, was reduced to a temporary occupant. Her grief was now laced with a hot, bitter humiliation. The life she had built, her very identity as Mrs. Dubois, had been erased by a name she had never heard. She walked out of the law office into the blinding New Orleans sun, a pauper in a designer dress. She had lost her husband, and now she had lost the life they had built. Her grief was now tainted with a poison she couldn't name. She was haunted by a single question. Who is Cassandra Thorne? She didn't have to wait long for the answer. The very next day, the ghost walked right up to her front door. The ghost named Cassandra Thorne did not wait long. She arrived the next day, unannounced, a sharp, unwelcome squall blowing in from the Gulf. The doorbell chimed, and when Izzy opened the heavy cypress door of the home she no longer owned, she was face to face with a stranger. The woman was tall, sharp-angled, and exuded a cold confidence, encased in a perfectly tailored suit that seemed too severe for the New Orleans heat. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a flawless chignon, and her blue eyes assessed Izzy not with sympathy, but with a cool, calculating appraisal. "You must be Isabel," the woman said, her voice smooth but entirely without warmth. "I'm Cassandra Thorne. I believe we have a few things to discuss." Izzy stepped back in a stupor, allowing the woman to enter the grand foyer. Cassandra walked in as if she'd owned the place her entire life, her gaze sweeping over the high ceilings, the old oil paintings, and the marble floors. She was not a guest, she was a conqueror. They sat across from each other in the formal living room, a space filled with the memories of Christmases, quiet evenings, and Julian's laughter. Cassandra showed no deference, no remorse. She went straight to the point. "I assume Marcus has explained the terms of the will," she began. "I am here to answer any questions you might have." "My only question," Izzy whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse, "is who are you?" A thin, almost contemptuous smile touched Cassandra's lips. "I'm Julian's sister," she said, the words deliberately deployed for maximum impact. His older half-sister, to be precise, the daughter of his father and a woman he cast aside when he found out she was pregnant. "I am the secret the esteemed Dubois family buried for over 40 years. She told her story with a cold detachment, a tale of growing up with nothing, always aware of the wealthy father and the younger brother living a life of privilege who refused to acknowledge her existence. And then, she delivered the final, carefully constructed blow, the fake twist. "About a year ago, Julian found me," Cassandra said. "He was tormented by guilt, by the sins of our father. He wanted to make things right. He saw the will as the only way to atone, to give me back the birthright that was stolen from me." The story, in its own cruel way, made a kind of sense. It painted a picture of Julian, not as a malicious husband who had fallen out of love, but as a man torn apart by a tragic family history, trying to do the right thing in a clumsy, painful way. The betrayal was still there, deep and agonizing, but it was now colored with tragedy. Izzy wasn't the victim of malice, merely the collateral damage of a history she had never known existed. The fact that Julian had kept such a monumental secret, had faced this demon entirely alone without breathing a word of it to her, was a betrayal all its own. Cassandra stood, running a finger along the edge of an antique porcelain vase. "I have no intention of making this more difficult than it needs to be," she said, with the tone of a CEO discussing a layoff. "My lawyers have advised me to take possession of the property within 30 days. I trust you'll be able to make your arrangements by then." The click of the front door closing echoed in the cavernous hall. 30 days. She had 30 days to dismantle a decade of her life, to pack away the memories of a marriage that was now revealed to be a lie. Her grief was a raw, open wound, and now, betrayal and humiliation had poured salt into it. As she began the heartbreaking task of sorting through Julian's belongings, deciding what to keep and what to abandon, she had no idea that she was not just packing up a past. She was about to unearth a clue to the horrifying truth of his end. The heartbreaking work began, 30 days to erase a decade. The Garden District mansion, once Izzy's sanctuary of love and security, now felt like a museum of her own life that she was being forced to deaccession. Each room held a chapter of their story, and packing it into anonymous cardboard boxes felt like a profanity. She started with the hardest room, Julian's study. It was his haven. A room paneled in dark cypress, filled with his leather-bound books, his collection of antique maps, and the faint, lingering scent of old paper and bourbon. To go through his things, to touch what he had loved, felt like an intrusion. She carefully took his books from the shelves, each one sparking a memory. the novel he'd read aloud to her on a rainy evening, the book of poetry from which he'd quoted in their wedding vows. She saved his antique mahogany desk for last. It was the center of his universe. She cleared the top, boxing his fountain pens, and began to wipe out the drawers. As she cleaned the inside of an empty top drawer, her cloth snagged on a loose piece of decorative trim. Curious, she wiggled it. With a soft click, a section of the drawer's false bottom released, revealing a shallow, hidden compartment no bigger than a paperback book. Izzy held her breath. A secret drawer. In 10 years she had been in this room 1,000 times and never known it was there. A private space he had never shared. Her heart pounded as she reached inside. There were only a few items: an old pair of cufflinks, a dried gardenia, and a small tarnished silver locket on a delicate chain. It wasn't a piece she had ever seen. It looked old, an heirloom, but not from any part of the Dubois family she knew. She held it in her palm, feeling its cool weight. With slightly trembling fingers, she pried open the clasp. Her heart stopped. On one side, beneath a tiny pane of mica, was a faded portrait of a young woman. Though she was perhaps 20 years younger, there was no mistaking the features, the same sharp, high cheekbones and the same cold, piercing blue eyes of Cassandra Thorne. On the other side, etched into the silver in a minuscule, elegant script, were 3 words in French. Maman, je suis désolée. Mother, I am sorry. Izzy snapped the locket shut, the soft click echoing in the silent study. I am sorry, Mother. The inscription was an anomaly, a puzzle piece from a completely different box. Cassandra's story was one of a brother, atoning for their father's sins, a righteous act of guilt towards her. But this locket told a different story entirely. The apology wasn't directed at Cassandra. It was directed at Julian's mother, a sainted woman long dead. Why would Julian apologize to his mother in a locket containing the image of his secret half-sister? It made no sense. The narrative of a guilty man trying to do the right thing suddenly felt deeply wrong. This locket didn't speak of guilt. It spoke of shame, of regret, of a secret he was keeping from his family, not a sin he was rectifying for it. The woman in the photograph wasn't a sister he was trying to save. She was a threat he was trying to manage. The grief in Izzy's heart was suddenly joined by a new, sharp-edged feeling: suspicion. The story of her husband's death had just become a mystery, and this locket was the first clue. Suspicion, once rooted, is a more potent motivator than grief. The fog that had enveloped Izzy's world began to burn away, replaced by a sharp, cold focus. She was no longer a passive victim of circumstance. She was a widow with a question, and she knew exactly who could help her find the answer. She met Marcus Baptiste at a quiet café in the French Quarter, far from the prying eyes of their social circle. She placed the tarnished silver locket on the small marble table between them. Julian kept this in a secret compartment in his desk, she said, her voice steady, devoid of its earlier tremor. Marcus frowned, picking up the locket. He opened it, studying the tiny photo of Cassandra and the inscription. Cassandra's story is that Julian felt guilty on behalf of his father, Izzy explained, laying out the pieces. An act of atonement for an abandoned sister. But this locket is an apology to his mother. It doesn't track, Marcus. The emotional logic is wrong. This is a different story. Marcus, with the logical mind of an attorney, stared at the inscription. He slowly nodded, his initial skepticism giving way to professional intrigue. You're right, he conceded. It doesn't add up. He placed the locket down. All right, Izzy. Off the record. Let's see what we can find. Their investigation began with the official narrative of Julian's death. Marcus used his legal credentials to obtain the complete file from the sheriff's department and the coroner's office. That night, in the quiet of his office, they spread the documents out under the glow of a desk lamp. The report was straightforward and tragic. Julian Dubois, age 42, died of blunt force trauma, consistent with a fall of approximately 50 feet from a scenic overlook on the Oxner Loop Trail in the state park. Time of death was estimated to be around 3 p.m. There were no signs of a struggle. His wallet and phone were found on his person. Ruled accidental, case closed. It was all neat. Too neat. Izzy picked up a crime scene photograph, one taken from Julian's phone. It was the last picture he ever took, time-stamped at 2:45 p.m., 15 minutes before his estimated time of death. It was a beautiful panorama of the bayou stretching out below. Wait a minute, Izzy said, her voice barely a whisper. The Oxner Loop. Julian hated that trail. Marcus looked up from the report. Hated it? But it's one of the most popular spots. Exactly, she affirmed. He called it the tourist trail. He said the view was generic. His favorite trail, the one he always took, was the Barataria Trail on the other side of the preserve. It was tougher, more authentic, he said. He wouldn't have been on the Oxner Loop, especially not in the middle of a Tuesday. Another memory sparked, a small but dissonant detail. And his hiking boots, she said, recalling the personal effects the police had returned. The report says he was wearing his old Merrells, but he had just bought a brand new, expensive pair of Salomons he was obsessed with. He wouldn't have worn the old ones on a real hike. Those were for yard work. These were not the sentimental ramblings of a grieving wife. They were concrete inconsistencies in the victim's behavior. They didn't prove murder, but they proved the official story was flawed. Marcus stared at her, the implications of her words settling in the quiet office. Julian wasn't on his favorite hike. He was on a tourist trail, wearing the wrong shoes, as if he had been lured there under false pretenses. The official report was no longer a neat conclusion. It was a poorly written story with glaring plot holes. He wasn't there for the hike, Izzy whispered, the horrifying truth beginning to take shape. He was there to meet someone. Their investigation was no longer about Julian's past secrets. It was now about Cassandra Thorne's. They needed to find out who she really was and what she was capable of. The investigation now centered entirely on Cassandra Thorne. Marcus, harnessing the resources of his law firm and the quiet fury of a man mourning his best friend, hired the most discreet private investigator in New Orleans. While Marcus chased the ghosts of Cassandra's past, Izzy returned to her own, tearing apart Julian's study, a room she now viewed not as a sanctuary of memories, but as a crime scene. Marcus's call came 3 days later. "Izzy," he said, his voice tight with something she couldn't quite place. "I think you should sit down." The investigator had hit a goldmine. Cassandra Thorne was only her most recent identity. 10 years ago in Phoenix, she was Cassidy Reno. 15 years ago in Miami, Catherine Taylor. She was a professional grifter, a chameleon who preyed on the wealthy, leaving a trail of small-time scams and broken hearts. But that wasn't the worst of it. In Phoenix, Marcus continued, his voice low, as Cassidy Reno, she befriended a wealthy, elderly widower, became his sole caregiver and companion. A few weeks after he abruptly changed his will to leave her a substantial sum, he died. "How did he die?" Izzy asked, a cold dread creeping up her spine. "A fall," Marcus said, and Izzy felt the air leave her lungs. Down the stairs in his own home. The police looked into it, but it was eventually ruled a tragic accident. No evidence of foul play. A pattern. A lethal, terrifying pattern. Cassandra wasn't just a long-lost sister. She was a predator. Meanwhile, Izzy, driven by a chilling premonition, had methodically dismantled Julian's desk. She knew there had to be something else. She pulled out the secret drawer again, running her fingers along every surface. This time she felt it, a slight ridge on the underside of the drawer's top. Taped there, flat and hidden in the darkness, was a slim, leather-bound book. A journal. The one Julian always told her was just for random business notes. The early entries were just that. But as she flipped to the weeks leading up to his death, the handwriting grew frantic, almost illegible. And then she found it. The truth. April 15th, he had written. Cassie found it. Somehow that devil found the letter. "Mother made me promise never to tell a soul. I'm sorry, Mayman, I failed you." Izzy read on, her breath catching in her throat. The secret wasn't his father's. It was his mother's. Decades ago, long before his father passed, Julian's sainted, respected Creole mother had a brief, desperate affair. Julian was the result. He was not Antoine Dubois's son. He was not a Dubois by blood. If revealed, this secret would not only shatter his mother's pristine legacy, it would invalidate his own claim to the entire Dubois family fortune under the archaic, patriarchal terms of the family trust. Cassandra somehow had discovered this truth. She hadn't come to Julian as a sister seeking reconciliation. She had come as a blackmailer, demanding the entire inheritance in exchange for her silence. And then, the final entry, written on the morning of his death, shattered Izzy's heart completely. Meeting Cassie at the Oxner Overlook. She says it's to finalize the transfer. Feel like a fool, wearing these old boots, carrying no gear. This isn't a hike, it's a ransom. God, I'm so scared. It's not just greed in her eyes. There's something broken in there. Something cold. The journal slipped from her trembling fingers. The story was complete. Julian hadn't been a traitor. He had been a victim, trapped by a secret that wasn't his, and a predator he couldn't escape. The man she had begun to doubt was returned to her, not as a perfect husband, but as a terrified man who had been murdered in cold blood. Her grief and her rage fused into a single white-hot purpose. She picked up the journal, the last words of her husband, a testament to his murder. The police had said they needed evidence. Now she finally had it. The grief and rage fused into a single white-hot purpose: justice. Clutching Julian's journal, Izzy called Marcus, her voice a low, urgent command. I have it, Marcus. I have the proof. It's all here. They met with a homicide detective the next morning at NOPD headquarters, a brutalist concrete building that felt a world away from the genteel elegance of the French Quarter. The detective, a seasoned, weary-looking man named Boudreau, with eyes that had seen too much, listened patiently in a small, sterile interrogation room. Izzy, with Marcus at her side, laid everything out. She spoke with a clear, irrefutable logic. They presented the pattern of Cassandra's life, the string of aliases, the suspicious accidental death of her benefactor in Phoenix. They pointed out the glaring inconsistencies in Julian's final day, the tourist trail he despised, the old boots he wouldn't have worn. And then, with a sense of finality, Izzy slid Julian's journal across the metal table. This is the last entry, she said, her voice unwavering. Written the morning he died. He was being blackmailed. He was terrified. He was lured to that spot, and she killed him. It's all there, in his own words. She sat back, confident, expectant. She had delivered the smoking gun. She had solved her husband's murder. Now, she expected the detective to get a warrant, to dispatch officers, to finally bring the full weight of the law down on Cassandra Thorne. Detective Boudreau read the final entry slowly, his expression unreadable. He closed the journal and gently pushed it back across the table. He sighed, a long, tired sound. Mrs. Dubois, he began, his voice laced with a genuine, if practiced, sympathy. I've been a cop in this city for 30 years. My gut tells me you're right. I read this, I hear your story, and I believe you. Izzy felt a surge of relief. So you'll arrest her? The detective shook his head slowly. I can't, and that's the problem. Your husband's journal, it's powerful. It's his state of mind. But legally, that's all it is. A good defense attorney will tear it to shreds. They'll say he was a distraught man, maybe depressed, writing down paranoid fantasies. It's circumstantial. What about her past? Marcus interjected, his lawyer's tone sharp. The death in Phoenix? Different jurisdiction. A decade ago. Case closed, Boudreau countered. Completely inadmissible in court. The trail, the boots. It's odd, I'll grant you. But it doesn't prove a thing. A man's allowed to change his mind about where he wants to hike. He leaned forward, his eyes meeting Izzy's. The coroner's report says he fell. There were no defensive wounds, no foreign DNA under his fingernails, no witnesses. Without new physical evidence linking Cassandra Thorne to that cliff on that day, my hands are tied. I can't get a warrant from a judge. I can't reopen a closed, accidental death investigation. I am truly sorry. The words hit Izzy with the force of a physical blow. The system she had believed in, the very concept of justice, was a bureaucratic machine that ran on a fuel she didn't possess. The truth, so clear and undeniable to her, was useless. The law, which was supposed to be a sword for the innocent, was instead a shield for the guilty. Cassandra Thorne, predator and murderer, was going to get away with it. They walked out of the police station into the sticky afternoon air, the weight of defeat heavier than her grief had ever been. The path to legal justice was a dead end. Cassandra was going to walk away with everything: Julian's life, his name, his fortune. As Izzy looked at Marcus, the despair in her eyes slowly began to harden into something else. Something cold, sharp, and dangerous. If the law refused to give her justice, then she would have to create her own. A different kind of justice. The kind that didn't need a courtroom. They walked out of the police station and into the oppressive humidity of the late afternoon, the weight of their defeat, a tangible thing. The truth, which had felt so solid and powerful in their hands, was nothing more than a ghost, unable to touch the real world of legal procedure. Izzy got into the passenger seat of Marcus's car, the journal lying useless on her lap. "So, that's it?" she said, her voice a hollow echo of the righteous fury she had felt just an hour before. "She just wins? She kills him, takes his name, his home, his fortune, and she just walks away?" "Izzy, Marcus began, but there were no words of comfort that could span the chasm of this injustice. The despair that washed over her was absolute. It was the lowest point of her life, a bottomless pit deeper than the initial shock of Julian's death. Her husband was gone, his killer was untouchable, and she was in exile from her own life, left with nothing but a cheap stipend and the useless, agonizing truth. She leaned her head against the cool glass of the car window, watching the vibrant city life pass by in a blur of color she could no longer feel. Cassandra had won. But as she sat there, marinating in her own powerlessness, something began to shift. The despair, so vast and all-consuming, began to curdle. The image of Cassandra's triumphant, contemptuous smirk from the day she'd claimed the house flashed in her mind. She hadn't just taken the inheritance, she had gloated. She was arrogant. And her arrogance was fueled by one thing: the money. The thought was a tiny, cold spark in the darkness. The money. Her grief for Julian was real and endless. Her rage at his murder was pure and righteous. But the law had deemed it irrelevant. The detective's words echoed in her head. Without new physical evidence, that door was closed. She could not prove Cassandra Thorne was a murderer. The spark grew into a cold, steady flame. Her focus shifted. The rage was no longer a hot, helpless anger at the injustice of the murder. It became a cold, intellectual, and deeply personal fury at the motive. Cassandra hadn't killed Julian for sport. She had killed him for a prize, for the Dubois estate, for the life she felt she was owed. And that was the weak point. That was the target. Izzy sat up straight, her eyes, once clouded with grief, now terrifyingly clear. "The police are right, Marcus," she said, her voice so different he turned to look at her. The fragility was gone, replaced by a diamond-hard resolve. "We can't prove she's a murderer." He started to offer some empty condolence, but she cut him off. "So we won't," she continued. "We're not fighting that battle anymore. This isn't about sending her to prison for murder. This is about making sure she gains nothing from it. We're going to prove she's a fraud. Izzy, the will is ironclad. We've been over this." "I don't care about the will," she said, the plan forming with a chilling clarity. "The will is just the ticket that lets her into the vault. I'm going to find a way to burn that vault to the ground with her inside it. She thinks the money is her shield. We're going to make it her cage." Marcus stared at her, at this new woman sitting beside him. The soft, grieving widow he had been trying to protect was gone. In her place was someone he didn't recognize, someone cold and dangerous and utterly determined. He saw the same unwavering resolve that had been Julian's greatest strength, now honed to a razor's edge. This was no longer about helping a victim find peace. This was about becoming an accomplice to a different kind of justice. "Okay, Izzy," he said finally, his voice full of a new gravity. "Okay, where do we start?" A new dangerous alliance had been forged in the quiet of Marcus's car. The shared grief for Julian was now the foundation for a shared conspiracy. Izzy was no longer just fighting for justice. She was fighting to ruin the woman who had stolen her life. Their new war room was Marcus's office, late at night. The police reports were put away, replaced by stacks of financial documents, property deeds, and century-old trust agreements that constituted the Dubois estate. The battlefield had shifted from forensics to finance. "The will is her shield," Izzy said, her voice cold as steel as she stared at the complex web of assets spread across the desk. "We need to turn it into her cage." The Dubois fortune, she explained to Marcus, wasn't simple. It wasn't a modern portfolio of stocks and bonds. It was old, Creole money, a labyrinth of multi-generational land trusts, historic French Quarter townhouses, and vast tracts of former sugarcane land that had been in the family since the Napoleonic era. It was illiquid, archaic, and governed by Louisiana's unique, complex property laws, a system Julian had spent years mastering. Cassandra Thorne, a grifter accustomed to fast cash confidence schemes, had just inherited a legal and historical minefield. To get the fortune she'd killed for, she couldn't just write a check. She would have to liquidate the assets, a slow, painstaking process. And Cassie is not a patient woman, Izzy murmured, a predatory gleam in her eye. She's a shark. She wants to feed now. This was where Izzy's own past, the career she had sacrificed, became her greatest weapon. As an architectural historian, she had a unique understanding of old documents, of provenance, of the very history that underpinned the Dubois fortune. Julian, proud of his lineage, had often shown her the original deeds and trusts, not as financial instruments, but as historical artifacts. She had studied them out of love and intellectual curiosity. Now, she studied them as a general studying a map of enemy territory. Her finger traced a line on a brittle, yellowed document from 1888. "Here," she said, her voice sharp with discovery. "Look at the language. It's all over the oldest trusts." Marcus leaned in, adjusting his glasses. The document was filled with archaic French legal terms. Izzy pointed to a specific recurring word, usufruct. "Usufruct," she explained, the old academic lecture tone returning to her voice. "It's an old remnant of Louisiana's Napoleonic Code. It splits the ownership. One person, the usufructuary, has the right to use the property and enjoy its profits, the fruits. But another person, the naked owner, retains the actual, underlying ownership. You can't sell what you're only allowed to use." She pulled out another file. "Julian's great-great-grandfather split the ownership of the most valuable plantation lands. He gave his sons the usufruct, but he passed the naked ownership down through a different family line, to a web of distant cousins, to ensure the land itself could never be sold off." The implication dawned on Marcus's face, a slow, awestruck realization. So Julian, he had the right to the profits from the land, the farming leases, the mineral rights, but he never had the right to sell the land itself. "Exactly," Izzy confirmed. "And Cassie has inherited his exact position. She has the right to the income, but she doesn't own the land. But she's not going to know that. She's arrogant, impatient, and she's not going to hire a team of historians to parse a 200-year-old document. She's just going to see a portfolio worth hundreds of millions of dollars." Marcus looked at her with a new kind of awe. She was no longer just a grieving widow. She was a brilliant historian who had just unearthed a legal tripwire buried for over a century deep in the Dubois estate. "She'll try to sell it all," Marcus said, the pieces of the trap clicking into place in his mind. "Of course she will," Izzy replied, a cold, dangerous smile touching her lips for the first time since Julian's death. "And we're going to make it as easy for her as possible. It's time to build a cage, Marcus. A cage made of contracts and her own signature." The plan, born from a dusty, 200-year-old legal document, was audacious. The cage was designed. Now, they had to build it and bait it. Marcus's office, which had once been a place of somber legal counsel, transformed into a war room, the air thick with conspiracy, and the low hum of a printer spitting out corporate registration forms. "We can't be the ones to approach her," Marcus said, pacing in front of the large window overlooking the city. "She's a predator. She'll smell a trap if it has any scent of us on it. We need a clean, credible third party, a ghost." He explained the idea. He had an old colleague from his days practicing in Texas, a man named Lawrence Bishop. Bishop was a semi-retired, universally respected real estate magnate from Houston, a man whose reputation for shrewd but fair dealing was legendary. Crucially, he owed Marcus a significant, career-saving favor from decades ago, and he existed entirely outside of the incestuous social circles of New Orleans. Bishop would be the frontman. He would represent a newly formed shell corporation, an entity Marcus meticulously crafted to be irresistible to someone like Cassandra. They named it Gulf Coast Heritage Properties, LLC, a name that sounded established, wealthy, and deeply rooted in the region. Marcus filed the paperwork, created a professional, if generic website, and established a corporate bank account. The ghost now had a body. The next step was the bait. It had to be a piece of cheese so large, so tempting, that the shark wouldn't bother to check for the hook. Their offer wouldn't be a standard, piece-by-piece acquisition. It would be a grand slam. Bishop, on behalf of Gulf Coast Heritage, would propose to buy out the entire portfolio of the Dubois rural land assets in a single, all-cash transaction, with a promise to close in less than 30 days. "We'll give her a story she can believe," Izzy said, her historian's mind now fully engaged in fiction writing. The company is consolidating a massive tract of land for a private ecological preserve. They have a deadline for the end of the fiscal year. They're willing to pay a premium for speed and convenience. The price they set was staggering, just below the official appraised market value, to seem like a savvy deal, but a 9-figure sum that represented the kind of fast, clean payday a grifter like Cassie could only dream of. It was freedom, power, and victory, all delivered in a single wire transfer. The final piece, the most critical part of the trap, was the contract. Marcus spent 2 days drafting the document, a dense 50-page monster of real estate boilerplate. He buried the poison pill deep inside, on page 47, in a subsection on seller representations. The clause was a single sentence of dry, innocuous legalese. The seller, Cassandra Thorne, hereby warrants and represents that she possesses fee, simple title, and full, unencumbered rights of conveyance for all properties and parcels listed in Appendix A of this agreement. Appendix A, of course, listed every tract of land in the portfolio, including the vast, valuable swaths governed by the ancient usufruct clauses. By signing that document, Cassandra would be committing a federal crime. She would be fraudulently attesting to ownership she did not have in exchange for a wire transfer that would cross state lines. Marcus printed the final draft, the heavy stack of paper thudding onto his desk. The fake company was real, the generous offer was drafted, and their frontman in Houston was waiting for the signal. Everything was in place. "Are you absolutely sure about this, Izzy?" Marcus asked, his voice low with the gravity of their actions. "Once we make this call, there's no going back." Izzy looked at the contract, at the intricate, invisible cage they had built with words and laws. She thought of Julian's last, terrified entry in his journal. She thought of Cassandra's cold, triumphant eyes. "Make the call," she said. The call was made. The intricate, delicate trap, months in the making, was set into motion. From their war room in Marcus's office, Izzy and he could only wait, a feeling of terrifying powerlessness descending now that the plan was out of their hands. The waiting was the hardest part. Lawrence Bishop, the silver-haired Houston investor, played his role to perfection. He placed the initial call to Cassandra Thorne, his voice a smooth Texas drawl, introducing himself as a managing partner at Gulf Coast Heritage Properties. He spoke of a unique, time-sensitive investment opportunity and requested a brief in-person meeting. As they had predicted, Cassandra, eager to establish her new status as the matriarch of the Dubois estate, refused to travel. She insisted he come to her, to the mansion on Prytania Street. The meeting took place in Julian's study. The detail, when Marcus relayed it to Izzy later, was a bitter pill. Cassandra was conducting business from the very chair where Julian had written his last, terrified words. Bishop's report of the meeting, delivered over a secure line to Marcus later that day, was a confirmation of everything Izzy had predicted about Cassandra's character. "She's exactly as you described." Bishop's voice crackled on the speakerphone, Izzy listening with bated breath. "Arrogant as they come, she acted like she was doing me a favor by even taking the meeting." He let out a dry chuckle. "She walked around that study like she was born in it, but you could see in her eyes she was just a tourist. She doesn't understand what she has. She only understands what it's worth." Bishop explained how he had laid out the offer, the 9-figure sum, the all-cash deal, the 30-day close. He had emphasized the convenience, the ability for her to liquidate a complex portfolio of rural, illiquid assets in a single, clean transaction. He had sold it as a shortcut to the finish line. "I watched her eyes when I said the number," Bishop continued. "That's all she heard. The rest was just noise. She didn't ask a single intelligent question about the historical deeds, the mineral rights, the land trusts. Her only real questions were about the wire transfer schedule and the tax implications for a sole beneficiary. Her mind was already spending the money. Cassandra, blinded by greed and her own inflated sense of brilliance, saw the offer not as a potential trap, but as a testament to her own formidable presence. She believed she had attracted this massive deal simply by inheriting the Dubois name. She saw Bishop not as a conspirator, but as just another old fool with money that she could easily separate from him. She had told him the offer was compelling and that she would have her lawyers review the purchase agreement immediately. Marcus hung up the phone, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. "She took the bait," he said, turning to Izzy. "Her lawyers have the contract." Izzy felt a tremor of something cold and final run through her. Their intricate cage of words and laws, so carefully constructed, was now set. Cassandra Thorne, so focused on the mountain of cash waiting for her, was about to voluntarily walk into it. She was about to pick up the pen that would serve as the instrument of her own execution. All she had to do was sign her name. The days that followed were the most agonizing of Izzy's life. The trap was set, the bait laid. Now, all they could do was wait to see if the shark would bite. Every time her phone buzzed, Izzy's heart leaped into her throat, expecting a call from Marcus saying the plan had been discovered. She imagined Cassandra's high-priced lawyers combing through the 50-page contract, their sharp eyes catching the subtle, archaic references, the deliberate legal sleight of hand. "They won't find it," Marcus had reassured her, his voice a low, confident rumble over the phone. "These guys are sharks, but they're modern sharks. They hunt for percentages, liability clauses, indemnity. They're not historians. They're not trained to look for ghosts in 100-year-old deeds. To them, our little poison pill on page 47 will look like standard, overly thorough boilerplate." He was right. Cassandra's legal team, a team of aggressive corporate lawyers, was focused on the money. They saw a 9-figure, all-cash offer, and their only job was to ensure the funds were legitimate and the closing was swift. They were not paid to do a deep, historical dive into the complex, Napoleonic-era legal structures of the Dubois estate. That would take months, the very thing their client, in her impatience, was trying to avoid. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. Izzy was with Marcus in his office, the two of them pretending to work, the air thick with unspoken tension. His phone rang, and the caller ID read L. Bishop. Marcus put it on speaker. "We have a signed contract, Marcus," Lawrence Bishop's calm Texas drawl said, without preamble. "Fully executed." Her lawyers made a few minor changes to the tax liability clauses, but the core representation of ownership was untouched. They didn't even flag it. He paused. "The closing is scheduled for tomorrow morning. The wire transfer will be initiated immediately after." A profound, heavy silence filled the room. This was it. The point of no return. It was not a moment of celebration. It was the grim, quiet finality of an executioner receiving his orders. The next day, as Izzy sat in her small temporary apartment, she pictured the scene. She saw Cassandra in a sleek downtown boardroom, her posture radiating arrogance and victory. She saw her take the expensive fountain pen and sign her name with a confident, ostentatious flourish. In that moment, Cassandra believed she was signing the final document of her triumph, the culmination of a lifetime of scheming that had finally paid off. She had no idea she was signing her own confession. Later that afternoon, Marcus received a secure email. It was a copy of the wire transfer confirmation. A 9-figure sum had been moved from Gulf Coast Heritage Properties' corporate account to an escrow account and then released into a private bank account under the name Cassandra Thorne. The crime was now complete, documented, and irrefutable. Cassandra Thorne was, for one brief, glorious moment, one of the wealthiest women in Louisiana. She had the liquid cash she had killed for. She was free. She was powerful. She was, in her own mind, untouchable. Izzy imagined her in the Garden District mansion, popping a bottle of vintage champagne, her laughter echoing in the halls that should have been Izzy's. Izzy looked across the desk at Marcus, who was now holding the 2 key pieces of evidence: a copy of a contract fraudulently representing ownership and proof of payment for that fraudulent representation. The last trace of fear vanished from Izzy's eyes, replaced by the cold, clear light of imminent justice. "She has the money," Izzy said, her voice quiet and even. "She thinks it's over. She thinks she won." Marcus nodded, his hand already reaching for the phone to call the litigator he had on standby. The time for stealth was over. It was time to attack. "Not for long," he replied. "The cage is locked. Now we let the world see the monster inside." The attack was not a quiet, stealthy maneuver. It was a declaration of open war. The morning after the wire transfer, Marcus Baptiste, acting on behalf of a newly formed coalition of plaintiffs, filed a massive civil fraud lawsuit against Cassandra Thorne. The plaintiffs were not just Lawrence Bishop's shell company, claiming to have been defrauded. They were the true, naked owners of the Dubois estate lands, a dozen distant, aging Dubois cousins scattered from Lafayette to Baton Rouge, whom Marcus had painstakingly tracked down and who were now poised to reclaim their ancestral rights. Simultaneously, Marcus filed for an emergency ex parte injunction to freeze every known asset belonging to Cassandra Thorne. The evidence presented to the judge was irrefutable and overwhelming. The centuries-old land trust documents establishing the usufruct, the 50-page contract where Cassandra explicitly warranted her right to sell, and the digital record of the 9-figure wire transfer she had accepted based on that fraudulent claim. The judge granted the injunction immediately. Cassandra received the news, fittingly, while living the life she believed she had earned. She was at a private showing at a high-end art gallery on Royal Street, preparing to acquire a ridiculously expensive painting. Her phone buzzed. It was her bank, calling to inform her that her accounts, including the one that had just received a massive influx of cash, were frozen by federal court order. Her initial reaction was sputtering, indignant rage. She assumed it was a clerical error, a bureaucratic insult. Then, the call came from her shell-shocked lawyers. A lawsuit. An injunction. Fraud. The words were meaningless to her. How could it be fraud? She had the will. The money was hers. In her profound arrogance, she could not comprehend that she had been so thoroughly and completely outmaneuvered. The legal battle that followed was not a protracted dramatic trial. It was a swift, brutal, and clinical execution. In the courtroom, Cassandra's high-priced legal team was powerless. They argued that their client was unaware of the archaic, obscure clauses from the 19th century. They argued she had acted in good faith, based on the inheritance granted to her. But their arguments crumbled under the cold, hard weight of the evidence. Marcus's litigation team was merciless. They brought in legal historians to testify on the immutable nature of Louisiana's usufruct laws. They put Lawrence Bishop on the stand, who testified that he had entered into the deal based solely on Miss Thorne's contractual guarantee that she had the right to sell. The centerpiece of the trial was the contract itself. Her own signature, in bold, arrogant ink, was the primary weapon used against her. The judge's ruling was decisive. The sale was declared void. Cassandra Thorne was found liable for civil fraud on a catastrophic scale. The money, every last cent she had killed for, was to be returned, and all assets of the Dubois estate were to be placed in a court-appointed receivership until the complex ownership could be untangled. She had lost. In a matter of weeks, the fortune she had schemed, manipulated, and murdered to obtain had vanished. But for Izzy, it wasn't enough. A civil judgment was just about money. Justice for Julian required more. As they left the civil courthouse, triumphant, Marcus handed Izzy a new document he had just received. It was a notice from the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Louisiana. Based on the overwhelming evidence of the civil trial, the Department of Justice was pressing federal criminal charges against Cassandra Thorne for wire fraud. The final act was about to take place, not in a civil court where the penalty was financial, but in a criminal one, a court where the price of her greed would be her freedom. The criminal trial was a formality, an epilogue to a story whose ending had already been written. The federal prosecutors presented the same elegant, airtight case that Marcus had presented in civil court. The signed contract was Exhibit A. The wire transfer confirmation was Exhibit B. The jury was out for less than an hour. The verdict, when it was read, was a foregone conclusion. Guilty on all counts of wire fraud. The day of the sentencing brought Izzy back to the courthouse one last time. She stood under the same ancient oak tree, a silent observer waiting for the final curtain to fall. She was there to bear witness. For Julian, the heavy doors of the courthouse burst open, and the scene from her memory replayed itself in real time. The marshals, the cameras, and between them, Cassandra Thorne, her face a mask of incandescent rage. As they led her down the steps, her wild eyes found Izzy, and she lunged, screaming, her voice a raw shriek of pure venom. You sanctimonious little nobody, you think you've won?" And in that moment, as Cassandra raged, Izzy saw it happen. She saw the pure, animalistic fury in her eyes begin to curdle, replaced by the flickering, dawning horror of comprehension. The puzzle pieces were finally clicking into place in Cassandra's mind, far too late. The too-good-to-be-true offer from the folksy Houston investor. The convenient, all-cash deal. The impossibly complex contract her lawyers had dismissed as boilerplate. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't bad luck. It was a trap. A perfect, intricate, and inescapable trap. And the architect of that trap was not a rival corporation or a federal investigator. It was the quiet, grieving widow she had dismissed as a piece of furniture, an irrelevant, emotional woman to be swept aside. In that final, crushing moment of realization, Cassandra Thorne understood that she had been completely and utterly outplayed by the one person in the world she had never even considered a threat. Her ruin was absolute. The money she had killed for was gone, locked away by the courts. The freedom she had craved was a memory, about to be replaced by a prison cell. And it had all happened because of her own blinding greed and her fatal, arrogant underestimation of the woman she had wronged. The marshals forced her into the back of the sedan, and the door slammed shut. The car sped away, carrying Cassandra Thorne to the empty, desolate future she had earned. Izzy stood in the quiet aftermath, the roar of the press fading into a distant buzz. She reached into her pocket, and her fingers closed around the tarnished silver locket. She pulled it out, the metal warm against her skin. She opened it and looked down at the tiny, faded photo of the young, hungry-eyed woman who had just been driven away. Then her gaze shifted to the inscription, Julien's last apology, Maman. Je suis désolé. He had been sorry for the secret he was forced to keep, the shame that had made him vulnerable. Izzy snapped the locket shut. Her justice was complete. It wasn't the justice of the law, perhaps, but it was the justice of a promise kept to a murdered husband. Her long, terrible month was over. And for the first time since the day he died, Isabelle Dubois could finally, truly, begin to grieve. Cassandra was convicted of fraud, not murder. Izzy's revenge was perfect in its own way. She took away the very thing Cassie killed for. But was this true justice for Julien's death? Or is any justice that doesn't punish the actual crime an incomplete and ultimately unsatisfying victory? Let me know your thoughts on this below. 6 months after the verdict, the New Orleans autumn finally brought a welcome coolness to the city. The oppressive heat of Izzy's long, terrible summer had broken. The scandal of the Dubois estate and the fall of Cassandra Thorne had faded from the headlines, replaced by new dramas, new storms. Izzy did not return to the grand mansion on Prytania Street. That house, she had realized, was a museum to a life that had never truly existed. Instead, she had used the small transitional fund Julien had left her to lease a beautiful, sun-drenched apartment in the Bywater, a shotgun house with high ceilings, worn wooden floors, and a small courtyard filled with overgrown jasmine. It was filled not with Dubois antiques, but with her books, her architectural sketches, and the quiet, steady presence of her own reclaimed identity. The courts were still untangling the knots of the Dubois estate, but Izzy was no longer a part of that battle. Her victory had been in the courtroom, but her peace was found here, in the life she was building from the ruins. She had started working again, consulting for a local preservation society, her passion for the city's history rekindled. Her revenge on Cassandra had been total, but she found that the satisfaction was a fleeting, hollow thing. The true, lasting peace came from something unexpected. It came from the rewriting of her own past. The jumbled, painful process of uncovering the truth had destroyed the idyllic, perfect memory of her marriage. That loss was a grief all its own. But in its place, something more complex and honest had taken root. She no longer mourned a perfect husband. She grieved for Julien as he truly was. A flawed, terrified man, trapped by a secret, who had loved her in the only way he knew how. Her revenge, she realized, had not truly been for herself. It had been an act of historical clarification, a final, fierce defense of the real man, not the traitor Cassandra had tried to paint him as, nor the saint from her own naive memories. One afternoon, sitting in her sunlit courtyard, she opened the tarnished silver locket one last time. She looked at the two secrets it held: Cassandra's face and Julien's apology. She understood them both now. With a quiet finality, she closed it and placed it not in a secret drawer, but in a small velvet-lined box with the rest of her own history, now finally complete, finally true.